Morning. I am Mark Kilman, the JNF National Board Member and the Chair of the National Water Task Force. And I want to welcome everybody this morning, or in your case, this afternoon back east, to this very special series of water webinars that we, the leadership of the Jewish National Fund, have decided to hold during these very unique and challenging times. And I want to say that at our national board meeting this week, Russell stated a very interesting fact to me, that 47% of the national nonprofit organizations in this country are closed up right now. But I'm very proud to say we should all be proud of the fact that the Jewish National Fund is up and running at pretty close to 100%. So that speaks volumes for the work we do and the dedication of our staff and our professionals. So thank you to everybody, and thank you for everybody who's taking time out of their day to be on this call. As you know, the Jewish National Fund has played a major role in Israel's water economy and has developed unique connections with key water experts in the US and in Israel. This series of 4 webinars will deal with different aspects of water, including technology, desalination, the Kinneret and its influence on Israel's water supply, recycling and wastewater management, water education, and JNF's different initiatives in all of these areas. It is my honor today to present our first webinar speaker, Seth Siegel. Seth is a best-selling author who wrote Let There Be Water, which delivers an urgent message on how the world can save itself from global water shortages using Israeli techniques and technologies, and who has partnered with JNF to heighten American awareness on the issue of water scarcity and Israel's importance to the world. Let There Be Water, initially released in 2015, which has been translated into 17 languages and is for sale in more than 50 countries. He now has a second book, Troubled Water: What's Wrong with What We Drink, which addresses the widespread contamination of America's drinking water and its impact on public health throughout the US. And I personally read this book and I recommend it to everybody. Recognized for his thought, leadership, and advocacy on water scarcity and quality issues, Seth is a senior fellow at the University of Wisconsin Center for Water Policy. His commentary has appeared in many leading publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Seth has spoken about water issues before hundreds of audiences on 4 continents and in more than 60 US cities, appearing at prestigious venues such as Congress, United Nations, World Bank, Davos, and Google headquarters, as well as dozens of universities, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. This webinar is going to last for 45 minutes. Seth will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then we will honor him by having questions and answers. So it is our great privilege and honor to have Seth Siegel. Seth, the microphone and the cameras are yours.
Thank you so much. Just shake your head if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting a message that my mic. You can hear me. Okay, good.
Yeah.
It's a great honor for me to be here. I'm so delighted to do this. It's a little strange. I've done lots of Skype presentations over the past several years, but this is certainly an unusual one. I've spoken, of course, to many JNF audiences around the US, and few things bring me more communal pride and pleasure than to do that. Although I've been a long time supporter, originally at a very modest level, by virtue of the research that I did for Let There Be Water, I came to know the work of JNF. I became a huge admirer of first Zevi Kahanov, who died way too young. You have to get her out of here, please. Way too young, and then of course Talia Tzur. And I'm sure 100% of the people on this call share my exceptional admiration for Russell Robinson, one of the really great Jews of our century, or last century and this century, and one of the great Jews of our time, and a visionary communal leader. I just want to say one last word, although I've not, and by the way, in the intervening years, I've become, whatever that club member is that you get that special ribbon for, a supporter of JNF. I just want to say one last word, although I'm not on the fundraising team at JNF, is that this is a very hard time. People's stock portfolios are cratered. People are feeling very insecure. And it requires all of us who not just care about water, but care about our community and care about our brothers and sisters in Israel, that we really have to double down and figure out what we can do. As bad as any of us are doing, I suspect we're doing better than vast numbers of our neighbors and Jewish organizational employees, and certainly vast numbers of people in Israel. So I did just want to say that. Okay, so the topic is called Water in the Time of Coronavirus, Lessons from Israel. And the title, of course, is an homage to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's classic novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. Cholera, of course, is a waterborne disease, and we are very lucky, I suspect, that coronavirus is not conveyed at all through the water. Viruses, of course, can be. Bacteria, of course, can be. But we have such a sophisticated water system now in Israel and in the United States that it is very rare, it happens occasionally, but it is very rare that viruses or protozoa or bacteria survive the treatment process, which is not to say things are perfect, and I'll get to that in my very final remarks today. As was mentioned, I've written 2 books. I'll just I have them both here. The first one was of course, Let There Be Water, which I think just about everyone on this call has. And then the more recent one is Troubled Water. And the difference between the 2 books is the first book, Let There Be Water, deals with water scarcity and uses Israel as a model for the world of how water scarcity, which is growing worse, by the way, we're not talking about it very much, but it's growing worse by the month. Maybe during the Q&A, we can talk about geopolitical considerations about water scarcity. But likewise, the second book deals with water quality. And these are related, but not necessarily always the same problem in the same places. In both of these areas, Israel is a leader, particularly in the area of water scarcity. Now, some of you have already heard me speak, and therefore, although Talia asked me to review some of these issues, I thought that it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about what I described in Let There Be Water before I segue into the new book and into more general topics. I'd like to start, though, maybe by words of inspiration, from one of the great Jews of history, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. We know, of course, Lubavitch and Satmar and all those are all offshoots of the Hasidic movement. And the founder of the Hasidic movement, somebody who embraced Judaism with a sense of rapture and joy, was the Baal Shem Tov. And he once wrote, and I'm sorry to read, I won't do any other reading today. He wrote, "If we were to walk in the woods and a spring appeared just when we became thirsty, we would call it a miracle. And if on a second walk we became thirsty at just that point again, the spring appeared yet again, we would comment on the coincidence. But if that spring were always there, we would take it for granted and we would cease to notice it. Yet, is that not yet more miraculous still?" And I think that that's something that in this time of travail and difficulty, it's a good moment, whether it's water itself or water as a metaphor, for us to take stock of the fact that there are many things that are working just fine in our world, and that we can be grateful for these things that we actually mostly take for granted, but which are no less miraculous. Now, in the course of my research for Let There Be Water, I interviewed somebody who was a senior desalination person at the National Water Utility at Mikarot. And I asked him if he thought that what Israel had done in water generally, not just in desalination, was miraculous. And he said that he is a religious person and that a miracle can only come from God, and that Israel's water system comes from the hands of men and women. And then he paused and he stopped and he smiled. He says, "But it is a miracle." And so what is that miracle? That miracle is in Israel that what Israel has done is it's figured out a way to address all 3 parts of the nature of water. Now, let me break that down for us. The first part, of course, is what comes out of the tap, our drinking water. The second part of that is what goes down our sink, our shower, our bath, our washing machine, our dishwasher, and our toilets, which becomes our wastewater. And the third part of a water equation for every society is irrigation. I know I have some friends, Glenn and Eileen, and Glenn was thinking the third essential part is slip and slide, but it's not. It's irrigation. So, the 3 key parts are drinking water, wastewater, and irrigation. Now, irrigation takes up the vast majority of water everywhere, In the U.S., it's about 85, it's about close to 85%. In Israel, it's about 2/3 of our water. In Israel, it's a little bit less than that. In some parts of the world, it goes as much as 95% of the water consumed. And therefore, although we sort of take it for granted, in the same way that Baal Shem Tov spoke of water being taken for granted, we should not, because as we grow as a civilization in the US and Israel, and as we grow around the world in population, we have ever greater need for more food, and with pollution and with climate change and with other stresses on that water is an ever greater risk of either running out or being inadequate. That's going to have profound impacts on our food supply. It's going to have profound impacts on stability for many nations, and it's going to have profound impacts for national security of the US and key regions of the world. So the reason why I wrote Let There Be Water was to have a conversation with public officials primarily, but also with media, with the public, with academics, but to have the conversation to start talking about the fact that few countries have done what Israel has done. And so the real key thing about water in the time of coronavirus, lessons from Israel, is the key lesson is that water is a special item. It's unique, but it is also something that if we don't pay attention to it, we're going to have massive problems. And that's true also on the quality side as well as on the quantity side. Now, let me just take 2 or 3 minutes for those of you who are new to my work, but not to bore those who are familiar with it, to talk about the handful of the key findings that I had in Let There Be Water and why Israel is a model for the world. First of all, Israel significantly embraces technologies. I'll get to those in a second. Israel also has something that we don't have in America anywhere, and that we don't have in much of the rest of the world, and that is that we don't have a non-political process for governing water. Most of the United States, water is very politicized, and therefore it creates a problem because it's under the purview of politicians who will use it for their benefit. Israel is purely a technocratic, apolitical approach to water, and that means that you get the highest, best use of water for the largest number of people possible. In addition, Israel believes in the use of market forces, which is ironic as Israel started as a socialist country, and it seized all of the water in the name of the people in the hands of the government, which is the opposite of a capitalist democratic approach. It's a socialist approach. Nonetheless, what we find in Israel is the fact that market forces play an extraordinary role in keeping demand down and also getting people to find alternatives to water. Now, what do I mean by that? Alternatives come in the world of technology. And so market forces, if you have to pay the full price for your water, you're more likely to be careful with it, you're more likely to fix a leak, but also you're more likely, if you can, to find an alternative for technology. And Israel, I will talk about very quickly, four very key areas where Israel has transformed the world in technology, and these are the following. First of all is, Israel is the inventor, as you all know, of drip irrigation. There are a number of companies in that field, and there's a new company that I'm very excited about that just has come out, which is going to radically change the world of drip irrigation yet further, a company called NDrip. And the disclosure of conflict is that I know the company well, I'm excited by it, I'm familiar with all that they're doing, and this is yet a whole new step up in the world of drip irrigation. What this means is that plants will be irrigated with about half as much water as is normally the case, and that the yields, because of the nature of drip irrigation, which I can explain during the Q&A, because of the nature of drip irrigation, it yields about 15 to 40% more yield. So therefore, you use half as much water to get an increased yield, which is a very special outcome. The next key technology is plant breeding. Now, there's lots of agitation you see on lots of packaging, non-GMO, which means non-genetically modified organism. And lots of people think, oh my God, I don't want to get plant-bred items because it's probably unhealthy for me. In fact, Israel is the world center of both GMO and non-GMO breeding, but all of Israel's plants, 100%, only use non-GMO. And the genius of Israeli scientific laboratories came about with the idea that how do we create plants that use less water? Now that comes about in a few different ways. First of which is that every part of a plant to grow it requires vast amounts of water. So if you can create a plant that has shorter roots or a different stalk or a shorter stalk or fewer leaves, you can focus your water needs on what is the fruit or the vegetable that's being grown. So for an example, tomatoes. Israeli tomatoes are grown in clusters like grapes, and there's almost no leaves, and the stalks are a different kind, and the roots, instead of being very long roots, which is normal for tomato plants, are only a few inches long. So that requires less water. The other thing that the plants have done is they've developed plants that thrive on salty water, brackish water, which otherwise has no use. It'd be discarded, it would never be drilled for. And so Israel can use up a lot of brackish water in the growing of their food without having to use up fresh water. The third technology I want to speak about briefly is wastewater. We think of wastewater in most of the world as a nuisance. In Israel, since the 1950s, wastewater has been thought of as an incredible opportunity. And indeed, today, close to 90% of the wastewater used in the country, that is created in the country, is clean to a very high level, clean enough actually that you could drink it if you had to, but nobody in Israel drinks that water. It's instead used in a parallel national drinking water system that is used specifically for irrigation with water cleaned to different levels used for different kinds of crops. Once again, huge savings on fresh water. If you think about the fact that in most of the world, between 2/3 and 85%, and a couple of outlier countries like Iran and Ethiopia and Egypt, it's 95%. If you think about that, to save that amount of water and to use, in essence, your wastewater and to use it again and again and again, creates an incredible benefit for society. And the third area, and this is going to lead us into the quality area, is desalination. As you all know, and anybody's on this call certainly knows, Israel is the world leader in desalination. It wasn't specifically invented, every part of it in Israel, but just about. And Israel has improved on it in terms of cost, in terms of usage of electricity, in terms of process, in terms of the technologies involved, to such an extent that now there's nobody really in the world who doesn't think of Israel as the center of desalination excellence. And that gap continues to grow, although Israel is very generous in sharing its technologies with countries and companies all around the world. Now, why is it that I say that desalination will lead me now into a conversation about quality? And that is because the fact that, and this gets into the subject of my second book, it turns out that a great deal of America's drinking water, in fact, I would venture to say the drinking water of every single person on this call, has some contaminants in it. And for a whole variety of reasons, which I'll touch on briefly, we really don't focus at all on improving the quality of that water. We take what is existing water and we say it's good enough, and no one is dying of cholera anymore, no one is dying of dysentery anymore, and we just let it be. But what we don't know, even though we have a suspicion, is what is the long-term health effects of those very many contaminants. And so the value of the Israeli desalination system is that effectively about 80% of the water consumed in Israeli homes comes from desalinated sources. Why is that incredible? It's incredible because the desalination process that takes out those nanoscopic sized salt molecules also remove those nanoscopic sized molecules that are the contaminants that we are consuming. This has obvious health benefits for Israelis, and in places where large amounts of desalinated water are used, it has health benefits as well. There's also a health detriment that we can talk about later, but it's a small one. And so the quality issues have been at a standstill in the United States for a very long time. And I'd like to just take I have about 8 minutes to go. I'd like to just talk a little bit more about why it is that in the United States we have a problem and what we can learn from the Israeli example. Okay, so what is the problem in America? The problem in America is that we use two technologies to treat the two of the three areas that I talk about, wastewater and drinking water. We use technologies that are basically 100+ years old. And while we have advanced rapidly in just about everything, transportation and technology and healthcare and military and you name it, we've changed and advanced, We are using technologies to clean our drinking water and to purify our wastewater that in the United States is basically a 100-year-old system. And although there are new technologies that exist and can be used at affordable prices, we choose to not do so because of a concern over what some mayors believe will become an unacceptable expense, or to put it another way, nobody's crying out about it. I make the point all the time that if you were to go, when we finally can do so, if you were to leave your home and drive down the street and every 100 yards there was a massive pothole, pretty surely you would call your mayor or you would call your city council member, and certainly if they didn't fix it over a few years, certainly over 50 years, you would vote them out of office. And likewise, if you visited your child or grandchild at school and a third of the desks were broken and a third of the chairs were broken and a third of the windows were broken, you would do the same. And I could go on with any civil service example, whether it's healthcare or schools or parks or roads or anything like that. But we accept in the United States a system in which one of every third pipe that we get our water from is broken. We don't notice it, even though we lose gigantic billions and billions of gallons of water on a daily basis. We don't notice it because it's underground. We don't talk about it because our media doesn't talk about it, our mayors don't talk about it, but it creates a problem. And then furthermore, the water that does get to us is water that's contaminated. Now, let me talk about the treatment and let me tell how this gets contaminated. The treatment process is as follows. For wastewater, once you flush your toilet or let water go down the sink, everything aggregates in a wastewater treatment facility. And what we do under federal law, it's legal, but it's not safe. We clean the water the way we did 100 years ago, before there were concerns about chemicals and pharmaceutical residues getting into our water. We clean the water to a certain level where we get rid of sort of, we'll call it the more disgusting things, the more smelly things. And then we dump it into a waterway, into a river, into a lake. And then those same rivers and lakes are the source of water that we take out. Now, what has been taken out are some large bacterial contaminants, mostly the stuff that you flush down the toilet. What's been taken out is little bits of skin that get washed off in the shower. But what does not get taken out, which then gets into our drinking water supply, is what has entered into American mainstream life over the last 50 or so years. And that is the subject of my new book, Troubled Water. The topic I talk about there, and it's an important one that has never been covered before in a meaningful way in a popular book. It's a lot of thousands of scientific articles. No one has ever pulled it all together for a popular audience. Similar, by the way, to the fact that people had written about Israel before, but no one had ever pulled it for Let There Be Water. What I did with Troubled Water is I pointed out that since about 1950, so call it 70 years, America has changed. We've changed in many ways, but we've changed in two significant ways that I want to highlight. First of all, we've become a very industrial society. And just to take farming as one of thousands of examples, in farming now, there isn't a farmer who doesn't use nitrate fertilizers. There isn't a farmer who doesn't put down pesticides unless he has an organic farm, or herbicides unless he has an organic farm, which is to say the vast majority of all farms have chemicals placed on their soils. What happens then? Well, a small amount of those chemicals are taken up by the plants, or they kill off the pests or the weeds, but the rest of them get washed into the water supply with spring or fall rains, or they get washed into the groundwater, and it comes back at us as drinking water. Well, you would think that it gets purified, but pause for a second. The second great change since 1950 is that America has become a very medicalized society, where people used to have very few choices from a medical point of view. You have an aspirin maybe, or you had prayer mostly, cough syrup perhaps. Now what you have is over 50,000 FDA approved pharmaceutical products. And when you take one of those products, you pee it out within a few hours. It gets into the wastewater supply. And because it is made to be durable and enduring, the wastewater treatment plant that treats out to be gross about it, the poop and the little piece of skin, the bacteria that takes care of that, is unable to break down those contaminants, those items which become contaminants. And so after the cleaning process is done, again, by federal law permitting this, the water is dumped into a waterway and comes back as drinking water. Now, before that water is now placed into a supply line into your home or your office or wherever, a little dab of chlorine is added. And that's the case in Israel, in America, everywhere in the civilized world. But what is not done, what does not happen is there's no effort to remove all those contaminants, the pesticides, the herbicides, the industrial solvents, and the many, many pharmaceutical products. And then what comes back at us to a degree that we don't understand what the health effect is, because the EPA has been asleep at the switch since at least the 1980s. We have no research going on to find out what the health effects are of what becomes a cocktail of these contaminants that come back at us. Now, I'm just about out of time. So I want to say that I have no illusions, especially given the deficits that cities, states, and the federal government are now piling up in fighting coronavirus and the economic consequences of it. I have no illusions that people are going to be jumping up and down on their chairs saying, well, let's spend another $1 trillion or whatever it will take to fix our water system so it's the healthiest water that technology allows. I don't have that illusion. I think for the next several years, we're going to be digging out of this very severe coronavirus trauma that we have been through. But I do think, nonetheless, that an engaged citizenry, an informed citizenry, starting with people who have a care and interest about water generally and water in Israel in particular, has a huge and acute value to be aware of the true story about what's going on with America's drinking water, which is that it is plentiful, it is nearly ubiquitous, nearly everybody gets water that is safe enough, but not as safe as it could be and should be. So as I close, I'm just reaching the very last minute or so of my time. As I close, I want to just identify 3 things as we go into this next period of time about what America can learn from Israel. What are the lessons from Israel following coronavirus? As a time that I have no suspicion that we're going to start spending vast amounts of money, even though we need to make our infrastructure better, to make our water supply healthier and safer. There are 3 things that we can learn from Israel. First, that Israel does that is nearly unique around the world is that Israel thinks far, far into the future. This is not a new phenomenon. This goes back to the 1920s and 30s, the pre-state Israel, when the Zionist pioneers and their leaders said, this is a time when there were a couple of 100,000 Jews in all of the land of Israel. When the pre-state Zionist leaders said the following, they said, well, if we're ever going to truly be the home for as many Jews as we'd like to have, if we are really going to ingather all the exiles, to use the Zionist phrase, we're going to need to be able to grow our own food and have vast amounts of water. But there's almost no water in the Middle East, then or now. And one of the reasons the British didn't permit more immigration was because they said there was an inadequate supply of water. So the Zionist pioneers started thinking early about how to enhance the supply of water. And with that 20, 30, 40-year head start, they have an advanced water system like no other country in the world. So first of all, plan far ahead. They did it in the 20s and 30s. By 1952, when the country was only 4 years old and they were bankrupt, that's when they began planning and thinking about desalination plants. That's when they began thinking and planning about taking wastewater and treating it and reusing it for agriculture. Hard to imagine that. A country that was so deeply in debt, yet they were embarking on a program to take on billions and billions of dollars of new debt. It was really a daring, exciting thing, but they said to themselves in 1952, well, because of what the people did in 1920 and 1930 and 1935, we now have enough water, and we'll have enough water probably until 1970. But we don't know what we'll have after 1970. So they began doing planning then. Most planning in America is done for a few years out. In Israel, it's done for decades out. And I reported in my book, Let There Be Water, that I interviewed somebody at the Israel Water Authority who was working at that time in maybe in 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. He was working on the 2050 Israel Water Plan so that they could develop the technologies and the infrastructure needed for Israel in the year 2050. So first important lesson is think far ahead, something that America does not do very well, but we should do better at. The second thing is that Israel has never stinted on providing adequate funding for its water systems. It's able to do that in more recent years because it charges the public and the farmers for the full price for their water that uses market forces I talked about earlier. But even when it wasn't had citizen payments, the government always made the decision to do what they had to do. I tell the story in the book as to one of the key reasons Ben-Gurion reported on why he agreed to take German reparations was that he could pay for the build out of the national water system. So you need to have adequate funding. And let me just pause for a second and say that among the great things that this water group does at JNF is that we help Israel push the envelope with just a little bit more every year by helping to secure their water future with the funding that we give to Israel. It's something that I'm proud, very proud, to earmark a significant part of my gift every year to JNF to help out with Israeli water. And the third and final piece that I'd like to just identify before I close and open up to questions is to say that Israel does something, again, that is very rare. Most places in the world take the attitude of good enough is good enough. I asked a senior water official in New York State several years ago. Talia was a few feet away from me, and we were talking to him. And I said to him, how good do you want the water to be in New York? And he said, good enough that I don't get too many complaints. Well, that's not the Israeli model. The Israeli model is to make water good, better, and great. And so the system may be okay, but it's not good enough. And we can make water systems everywhere better. And that Israel for sure is a model for the world. I started with a quotation from a great rabbi. Let me close with a quote from another great thinker, a poet, Bob Marley. He wrote once, "You ain't gonna miss your water until your well runs dry." Well, that's true for most of the world, but thankfully that's not the case in Israel. In Israel, they plan so far ahead, they think so much about their water, that they make sure that everybody has the water they need so that they can have an active, dynamic civil society with water as a key lubricant for that. So I'll stop here, just about exactly to the minute on time, and I'll hang out. Let me just say one or two last things about contacting me, because there's a great number of people, almost 300 people on this call. So if not everybody can get to me, I'll offer you my email address. And also I tweet rather constantly about water issues, a lot about Israel as well. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Seth M. Siegel, if you're on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, you can't do this. At Seth M. Siegel, and Siegel's S-I-E-G-E-L, and the M is like Mary or Mordecai, although it's not Mary or Mordecai. And if you'd like to get my email address, you can reach me one of two ways. It's either seth@sethmsiegel.com, or if you just simply go to www.sethmsiegel.com or www.troubledwater.us, you can email me through any of those approaches. So I'll open it up now, and let me turn it back to you. Or I don't know how we moderate it. You can't moderate it. It's not an audience like that. So I guess people just have to chime in, I guess, right?
Okay, well, we have a few questions submitted on the chat. People can use the chat. In a moment, we can open up the microphones, and people will, they'll unmute themselves to ask questions one by one. But the first question I see on the chat is, what exactly is Israel doing to remove pesticides and pharmaceuticals from its drinking water?
Okay, so what Israel does is it doesn't do anything much different than what much of the rest of the world does. It does have some agricultural remediation programs to block the flow of that into water supply. Mind you that Israel does not permit any farmer who sits over an aquifer to make use of chemicals that can get into that aquifer, which is not the case in the United States. In the United States, farmers can use chemicals of all kinds that can get into their groundwater. Again, there's a difference between surface water, which is a lake or river, which is what we dump our treated wastewater into, and groundwater, which is the stuff that we pump out of the aquifer. So in Israel, you can't use chemicals over an aquifer, and so therefore they preserve their aquifers, they preserve their groundwater. There's not really a lot of surface water in Israel other than the Kinneret and a teeny bit of the Jordan River and some other streams here and there. And then the most significant part of all of this is the fact that Israel desalinates most of the water that's used for drinking water, and that water is purified of any contaminants such as pesticides or herbicides.
Someone wants to know if you think that water companies are undercharging for water in the U.S.
I do, very much so. Yes. Until coronavirus stopped me from traveling, I was traveling, giving about 3 speeches a week, and I had 3 major points. One is that the EPA is not doing enough research. Number 2 point is that we have to use much more technology in America's drinking water. Number 3 is we have to consolidate our utilities. We have a shockingly large number. In Israel, of course, there's There's one national water utility, and then there's some service providers. In the U.S., no one ever believes me, but it's true. In the U.S., we have over 50,000 water utilities. We should have probably 200, 250. And the fourth point I make everywhere I go is that we are vastly undercharging for our water. We have an artificial price. And the reason that we have an artificial price, and there's a long section about that in the book, the reason why we artificially undercharge is that 85% of the water utilities of those 50 some odd thousand are controlled by local mayors and city councils or town managers. And they know that they are unable to get reelected or not get popular uprisings if they raise water fees, because it's seen as tantamount to a tax increase. So what they do is they artificially suppress the price of water, and that artificially suppresses the valuable resources of cash that they could use to hire advanced technology people to put in new technologies and to fix broken infrastructure, all of which would give us healthier, safer, cleaner water. Yes, water is too cheap.
Someone wants to know, how is Israel reintroducing minerals, including iodine, to the water that is removed from the desalination? I read that the people are deficient in minerals.
Yeah, iodine is not the problem at all. People get their iodine mostly from table salt. If we've all been to Israel, there's no shortage of salt in the food there. So no, iodine's not the issue. The issue is magnesium. And there's I think a foolish and lamentable dispute about this. There's some showing that magnesium deficiencies, that desalinated water removes magnesium from the water along with everything else. And there's some showing that people who exclusively drink water that's been desalinated are slightly more prone to getting heart attacks. They're talking about somewhere in the vicinity of 3 or 4 heart attacks a year, so it's not a large number. So there's been I think a fruitless and ridiculous argument for a number of years now in Israel as to whether or not they should add magnesium back into the water, the same way they add a crushed limestone in to the water. After they desalinate, they add stuff back in. Excuse me. And that I think that they should either just do it. It costs about $200,000 a year for the whole system, or they should pay to have magnesium supplements handed out to every man over the age of 45. It's primarily men over 45 who get this. There's no showing of women or younger people getting heart attacks from it. So that's the issue that you're talking about. I'm sorry, you're on mute. I can't hear you.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
What kind of water do you drink? Bottled, tap, filtered tap? What do you do outside of the home?
Oh God, I hate being asked that question. I hate it. Because let me tell you quickly why I hate being asked that question. I hate being asked that question because I try to make the point that it's not really relevant what I do, but that what's relevant is what we all should do as a society. But mindful of the fact that people are going to finish reading Troubled Water and they're going to say to themselves, oh boy, so I got contaminants in my water. It's going to affect me. If you're pregnant, it's especially going to affect you. If you're a fetus, very much an effect. And if you're as young as 2 or 3 years old, also a very significant effect. And so, and something that's now a very big worry because of coronavirus, if you're immunocompromised or immunosuppressed in any way, also these contaminants are a particular risk to you. So here's what I do. When I'm in New York City, I drink the tap water, even though I know it has contaminants in it. When I'm out in Eastern Long Island, where I am right now, I'm adjacent to a very large farming area. And I know that for decades, pesticides have been applied to the land and that nitrates are applied to the land. I will not ever drink the tap water here. I drink, in that case, bottled water. But as I talk about in my book, bottled water has its own contaminants problem. And shockingly, bottled water is, I'd love to talk about it more, but because of the interest of time, I won't. But anybody who wants to know about this can either read it in the book or I can share with you. Bottled water is one of the greatest scams of our time because it scared people into thinking that about 60% of Americans either never drink tap water or rarely drink tap water now. And And what we should do is we're spending a year $20 billion at wholesale and about $50 billion at retail. What we're spending on bottled water in the U.S., we could easily fix our water system in the U.S. In just a few years. People would go back to doing what they did before. So what I do is when I'm in New York, I drink tap water. When I'm not in New York, I tend to drink bottled water. I'll just add one other word about bottled water. Plastic bottled water is particularly at risk of health, particularly for pregnant women. And if you're going to drink bottled water, it's best to drink bottled water that's in a glass container. Again, much more about bottled water and troubled water. It's not a good alternative to tap water.
Yeah, somebody's asking, is desalinized water better than just bottled water?
Well, it depends. The answer is it depends. It depends on how that water is treated. That's in the bottle. So there are some water like Dasani and Aquafina, which again is in a plastic bottle, that goes through either an ozonization process, which is one way of cleaning it of contaminants, or a reverse osmosis system, which really cleans it out of contaminants. So it depends. I mean, you have to know a little bit more. I also end the book, I should have said before, with what you can do in your own home, whether you want to spend $30 or $4,000. I give a whole menu of things people could do for themselves, even though my goal is systemic societal change. But bottled water the other dirty little secret of bottled water, I'll just take one more second about it because I get asked this a lot, is that people assume that bottled water is uniformly better or higher quality. In fact, through a ridiculous loophole in federal law, 70% of the you won't believe this, of the 70 billion containers sold last year, 70% of them are subject to no federal regulation whatsoever. There's a loophole, which I won't go into now. And so you have no idea what's in that water. And even the other water that is under federal regulation, there's no one at the FDA, it's not the EPA, no one at the FDA who is responsible full-time for monitoring this. It's an honor system for the industry. And they are permitted to have up to 91 different contaminants in the bottled water, provided they can attest the fact that it's below a certain level, again, in an honor system. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, a few people asking about filters such as Brita or pure filters.
Yeah.
Filtering out the chemicals.
So I'll quickly answer that. I talk about that again in the last chapter of the book of Troubled Water. But I will just say very quickly is the two key things about Brita and other type filtered water like that is, number one is people foolishly and mistakenly think that, oh, it's filtered. That means it's filtered out everything. No, usually a standard filter will just filter out chlorine so that it doesn't taste too chlorinated. Or it'll filter out lead if you're buying a lead Brita filter. But you have to match your water profile and your water contaminants to the filter you're getting. And by the way, the filter you're getting still will never filter out all those many contaminants that the EPA doesn't regulate at all. And I didn't get a chance to get into that. That's the bulk of the other book, of the new book. The other thing to keep in mind is that what some people do is to squeeze an extra couple of weeks out of each filter to save money, they use their Brita filter longer than they should. And you must replace it on a timely level because otherwise the contaminants in the filter start to percolate into your water. Okay?
Very good. Any comments about Israel's new water from air technology?
Yes, I have a lot to say about that. I know that technology extremely well. I researched it and was considering writing a section about it in Let There Be Water, but it wasn't advanced enough at the time. I do write about it in Troubled Water as one of three very exciting technologies that are underutilized. The company that is the key driver of that in Israel is a company called WaterGen. I know them very, very well. They've actually asked me several times to sit on their board, but I've declined so I can keep my independence and not feel subject to feeling I have to say good words about anybody in particular. It's a very exciting technology. It still has some work to be done to prove that it can be delivered on a cost-effective basis. But what's great about it is it takes air, it takes the moisture out of the air, which means that you have no contaminants in it. All you're getting is the pure H2O. And if they can perfect the system beyond just being used for emergency situations, it could be the real game changer worldwide for drinking water. Nobody would ever again go thirsty. But you can't produce enough water for agriculture, but that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to replace drinking water.
Excellent, excellent. I'm just going to remind everyone who's asking about whether these calls are recorded. Of course they are. You can go to the YouTube channel called Jewish National Fund, youtube.com/Jewish National Fund. You can subscribe to the Jewish National Fund page on YouTube, on Facebook, and you can access our recordings there. We also have some upcoming video shows like this one. Tomorrow there's going to be a challah bake with our JNF First Lady, Lauren Lizzerbram, at 4 p.m. Eastern. And we have not one but two Kabbalat Shabbat programs on Friday afternoon, the details of which you can find at jnf.org/on-demand, jnf.org/on-demand. And let me turn it back to Mark Kelman for some.
Can I just say one quick word?
Yes, go ahead. Sure.
JNF has a wonderful podcast done by the beautifully voiced Stephen Shalowitz, and I was honored last week to be the subject of the podcast. So to the extent that people listen to JNF podcast, you can hear me on the podcast from I think it was last Wednesday. And if anybody, let me just say it last word, because it sounds like I'm being wrapped up. One more time, if anybody'd like to be in touch, this is really my life's work. I'm working on another book now, primarily about Israel. But this very much is what I care passionately about. And so I really do eagerly ask that if anybody has more questions to please reach out to me. I'm not soliciting anything from you other than your interest and your activism. I'm not trying to get your money for anything other than JNF.
Seth, this is Mark again. Thank you so much for your time. You've always been very generous with your time for the Jewish National Fund, and it is greatly appreciated. So with that, I do want to emphasize again, this has been a great call. We've had 300 people on this call, and we have more calls coming up. The next one is next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, and our own fantastic Tali Sor will be talking on the JNF water initiatives. The two after that will be on Tuesdays on April 7th and on Tuesday on April 14th. So keep looking into your inbox for the information and the Zoom Connect for those. And again, thank you, Seth. I want to thank Tali for putting these together. Tali, you've been fantastic, as well as the entire JNF staff and professionals for keeping us all interested and engaged with the Jewish National Fund during these extremely difficult times. So with that, Tali, unless you have anything to say, I'll sign off and tell everybody, please try to stay healthy during these tough times. Anything you can to stay healthy. Thank you all for participating.
Can you hear me?
Tali, I just want to say I'm getting a bunch of flash messages on my screen that people asking to please give contact information. So because I don't want to eat into the time for everybody else, anybody who needs to reach me can either reach me through the website or through Twitter, or in fact to call Talia and she'll provide it. Okay.
And not only that, Seth, I did share the links to your books, Let There Be Water and Troubled Water, in the chat. So anyone, who is interested in buying and reading it can have an easy access. And about next week, not only I will speak, we will have Dr. Clive Lipshin, who will explore with us the status of the Kinneret, our lake, famous lake in Israel, in the northern part of Israel, and the status. We had a very rainy season, luckily, this year. So Clive is going to speak about the Kinneret and the status and the impact on the water economy in Israel, and I will explore some of the JNF water initiatives in Israel. That's for next week, and stay tuned. You're going to get emails from us. And thank you again, Seth. You're the best. Shalom. Shalom. Bye. Thank you.